Since 1971, the US dollar has fallen well over 80%, and over that same time period, housing has become less affordable across much of the developed world, as prices rose faster than incomes in many countries. This isn't a partisan talking point, it's a structural outcome. And it points to something most political debates completely miss. The real divide isn't left versus right. It isn't markets versus planning. It's whether social order grows out of voluntary cooperation or whether it's imposed through authority backed by force. Now, there's two thinkers who fully agreed on the basic question of freedom, but they approached the problem from different analytical layers. Not different goals, not different principles, different answers to a different follow-up question. What actually keeps freedom from collapsing once it exists? The question runs through the work of Murray Rothbard and Hans-Hermann Hoppe. Most summaries frame this as a disagreement. Rothbard defends anarcho-capitalism through explicit moral theory, while Hoppe defends similar conclusions, but through praxeological and argumentative methods. Commentators sometimes describe this difference in tone as moral versus hardline, but these are informal characterizations, not formal categories. One is said to believe persuasion is enough. The other is said to believe exclusion is necessary. But I think that framing is misleading. They do not disagree about freedom, they do not disagree about property, and they do not disagree about the illegitimacy of the state. What they focus on is where freedom actually breaks down in real institutions. And that difference only becomes visible when you look at society through praxeology. Praxeology is the study of human action. It starts from a simple fact. People act purposefully, respond to incentives, and adapt to constraints. It doesn't ask what people should believe. It asks what happens when people act inside real institutions. Before talking about emphasis, it's important to be clear about agreement. Both rejected centralized political authority as illegitimate. Both grounded analysis in methodological individualism, meaning outcomes come from individual choices, not collective abstractions, and both defended self-ownership, private property, and voluntary exchange. Both opposed central banking, monopoly law, taxation, and regulatory privilege. This was not abstract theory. After the shift to fiat money, purchasing power steadily declined. Across many OECD countries, housing affordability worsened as prices outpaced incomes. Research consistently shows regulatory compliance costs fall more heavily on small firms, advantaging large incumbents. From an Austrian economics perspective, none of this is surprising. When political intervention distorts prices and entry, capital is misallocated. And when capital is misallocated, ordinary people pay the cost. On this diagnosis, Rothbard and Hoppe were fully aligned. Before moving on, there is one issue people always raise, and it needs to be handled precisely, and that's immigration. Rothbard and Hoppe were not answering the same question in this case. Rothbard analyzed migration under fully private property assumptions. In that world, movement is entirely contractual. There is no collective right to enter. Every decision rests on the owner's consent. Hoppe analyzed migration under existing state ownership. In that world, infrastructure, housing, schools, and welfare systems are politically controlled rather than privately owned. And that distinction matters. When infrastructure, schools, housing, and welfare are politically controlled, movement decisions impose costs on people who did not consent to them. This is not a free movement question. It is a cost allocation problem created by public property. Hoppe was not defending borders as a moral ideal. He was arguing that under statism, all migration policy is already coercive, and some institutional arrangements generate less forced integration than others. Rothbard agreed that public property creates moral confusion. He was more reluctant to treat the state as a legitimate proxy for private owners, even as a temporary measure. This is not a disagreement about freedom. It is a disagreement about strategy under statism. Once that distinction is clear, the issue becomes less of a wedge, and Sweden provides a concrete example. Municipalities were legally required to accept centrally assigned residents. In Stockholm, official housing queue data shows average wait times around 9 years, with many waiting much longer depending on unit type. Different assumptions, but a consistent analysis. Here's the clean way to understand where they differed. Rothbard focused on moral legitimacy and rights. Hoppe focused on incentives, decay, and durability. Those are not competing claims. They operate at different layers. Rothbard asked, what is just? Hoppe asked, what keeps that just system from being eaten away over time? Hoppe's analysis of democracy is a good example. Hoppe did not argue that voters are evil or stupid. They might be, but that's not what he argued. He argued that democratic institutions create short-time horizons. Politicians do not own the assets they control. They manage them only temporarily while in office. That creates a time preference problem. Time preference is simply how much people place on the present versus the future. Higher time preference means taking benefits now and pushing costs forward. At an institutional level, democracy tends to reward that behavior. There's also a knowledge problem, and I've said this many times in the past. Central decision makers cannot access the local, scattered, and often unspoken knowledge individuals use every day inside their heads. This is not a moral criticism, it's a structural limitation. Historical public finance data reflects the pattern. Debt declined for long periods under limited fiscal states, then expanded dramatically under modern bureaucratic and monetary systems, especially during and after major wars. Rothbard condemned democracy because it violates self-ownership. Hoppe analyzed how democratic incentives accelerate capital consumption. Different angles, but the same target. This brings us to culture. Some people claim culture explains everything. Others claim institutions explain everything. But praxeology shows they interact. Institutions do shape incentives, and incentives shape behavior, and repeated behavior becomes norms. And Argentina illustrates this dynamic perfectly. Economic historians note that Argentina had very high income levels before World War I, often using 1913 as a benchmark. Over the 20th century, monetary instability, capital controls had increased, and politicized labor policy coincided with inflation, capital flight, and informal markets. Rothbard emphasized the initial institutional aggression. Hoppe emphasized what happens after behavior adapts to broken rules. Neither treats culture as fixed or morally ranked. They're simply describing cause and effect. It's worth pausing here because nothing so far depends on ideology. This is all about structure. When property rights weaken, prices stop communicating real information. When prices lose meaning, investment decisions deteriorate. And when investment deteriorates, living standards fall. Intentions don't override incentives. Hoppe emphasized covenant communities, meaning contractual rules governing property use and entry. Rothbard emphasized individual rights protected through competitive institutions. Critics correctly note that private systems can fail. History shows that when exit options disappear, power hardens even without a formal state. That doesn't negate the framework. It defines its boundary conditions. The real distinction is not necessarily public versus private, it's contestable versus non-contestable power. When exit is real, authority remains conditional. But when exit collapses, domination follows. And this is why anarcho-capitalism stresses polycentric law and competition rather than trust. Rothbard grounded his case in natural rights and natural law. Hoppe added argumentation ethics as a consistency check. Argumentation ethics does not build a full political system, but it does show which positions contradict themselves once you try to argue for them. Natural rights supply substance. Argumentation ethics sets the boundaries. Together, they point to the same practical requirements: self-ownership, voluntary exchange, clear property norms. These aren't slogans, they're functional necessities. Critics are right about one thing: modern states persist because they can scale force in ways earlier systems could not. Surveillance, policing, and military capacity are unprecedented. Any non-state theory has to explain how that power is constrained or made prohibitively costly. Rothbard and Hoppe both understood this problem. Neither claimed to have fully solved it. That's not a failure, that's honesty. This isn't claiming private systems can't fail. This isn't claiming culture guarantees outcomes, and it isn't claiming that decentralization magically creates justice. It's making a much narrower claim. Freedom survives or collapses based on incentives, contestability, and enforcement capacity, not intentions. This isn't a story about conflict between thinkers. It's a story about layers of analysis. Rothbard explains why coercive authority has no moral standing. Hoppe explains why moral clarity alone doesn't keep statism from returning. They don't negate each other, they actually reinforce each other. Freedom isn't sustained by good intentions. It's sustained by aligned incentives, institutional limits, cultural feedback, and real exit options. Freedom isn't impossible. It just doesn't survive in societies that overwhelmingly reward, control, and punish exit. In other words, statism only wins where it faces no resistance. That's not a contradiction between Rothbard and Hoppe. It's actually the point where their analyses meet.